Welcome to this e-course on the characteristics of autism. My name is Sarah Corfanta, and this e-course provides you with a brief overview of the characteristics of autism spectrum disorder and general strategies to support this neurodiversity in ministry and educational settings. First of all, what is neurodiversity? The field and community of special education and other supports for people with special needs and disabilities has significantly changed the last 40 years. In only the last 15 years has special education been successful in being as inclusive as possible. Before people were served in school settings, they were often aborted or institutionalized. Most of the generations before Gen Y or millennials didn't even know their siblings with special needs or disabilities because they didn't grow up in the same household. People with disabilities were automatically institutionalized until well into the 90s. As public supports and the mainstream experience became slightly more inclusive, people with disabilities started having more of a voice. One of the biggest outcomes of this time was that demeaning labels were no longer tolerated, and person-first language was the most accepted way to talk about people with special needs and disabilities. In advocating for their loved ones, parents and caregivers started spreading awareness of the person-first language and in highlighting strengths. To differentiate, terms like neurotypical were used to describe the peers of those with autism that do not have autism. This gave way to neurodiversity and other similar terms. There's still a lot of controversy around this topic, but at the end of the day, if you are treating people with dignity and respect and loving them for who they are as a whole person, I know you will do the right thing. Just in case you're curious, I'm attaching some resources at the end of this training on widely accepted terms and language. Autism Spectrum Disorder is one of the most well-known developmental disabilities. Autism is called a spectrum disorder because the ways in which people with autism are impacted are far and wide, ranging from significant communication and cognitive impairments to people who may have lots of complex language but have difficulty socially. Along this spectrum, what is consistent is that people with autism have difficulty with socialization, communication, and have perseverative or rigid behaviors. In this presentation, we will review the characteristics of Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD, as well as highlight the strengths people with ASD bring to their communities. We will also discuss how parents or other stakeholders may go about getting a diagnosis for autism. Lastly, we will briefly review strategies to support ASD in ministerial or educational settings. To get us started, here are some stats about autism. As one of the most common developmental disabilities, autism is currently reported at 1 in 59 children. This ratio is actually higher or lower depending on the location. For example, New Jersey has a rate of 1 in 26 children, whereas Kentucky has a rate of 1 in 41. Autism is 4 times more likely to occur in boys than girls. Researchers have been unable to pinpoint why ASD is more likely to occur in boys, but have been able to narrow down some genomes related to autism, which means that autism is likely genetically connected. Autism also occurs across all ethnicities and socioeconomic status, and that does not seem to be a factor in the prevalence. Autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disability that is categorized by social and communication deficits and perseverative behaviors. Over time, the categorization of autism at different parts of the spectrum has shifted. It is currently the most widely accepted to categorize autism by one of 3 levels. When we look at the ways autism impacts a person's socialization and communication, we consider skills such as reciprocal relationships or the exchange between people and sharing interests, listening and talking, and showing concern for what someone might feel is important. We also see difficulty at varying levels of verbal and nonverbal communication, using appropriate eye contact and body language, and picking up social cues. Typically, people with autism will have difficulty in communicating or expressing themselves clearly or responding to social situations along unspoken social norms. These skills can be learned and practiced, and people with autism can lead very social and connected lives. The other characteristic of autism is perseverative behaviors. This can better be described by having fixed interests and repetitive behaviors. People with ASD may have difficulty straying from these interests, especially in social situations. Perseverative behaviors can also be categorized by repetitive movements, speech, or gestures, which are also known as stereotypy because they are stereotypical to people with autism. An example of this would be hand flapping, but could also be getting a phrase or thought stuck in their head or other repetition. It is also very characteristic of someone with autism to have an overly active sensory system, meaning that people with autism might be highly sensitive to the things in their environment, such as sight, sound, taste, touch, or smell. In other cases, a person with autism might be much less sensitive to their senses than most people and tolerate a good deal of pressure on their skin, loud sounds, or overwhelming noises without seeming to be bothered. The 3 levels of autism categorize the type of support an individual needs in order to overcome the varying difficulties of autism. Level 1 is categorized by the term requiring supports and means that without support there are noticed social and communication difficulties, as well as inflexibility in switching routines and difficulty with organization. Level 2, termed requiring substantial support, means the individual has difficulty with socialization and communication and may even be fairly limited in their independent communication. They also have repetitive or inflexible behaviors, often enough to be noticeable by others, and experience distress in navigating change. Level 3, termed requiring very substantial support, identifies the need for significant support for navigating verbal and nonverbal interactions. Individuals may not communicate verbally at all, or if they do, it is often difficult to understand, and the focus is trying to get needs met. There is also significant distress in coping with change or other inflexibility in shifting focus. This is my favorite part. Often, when we look at neurodiversity, such as autism, we overly emphasize areas of growth without really paying attention to what people with autism may have to offer. Like all people, those on the autism spectrum all have different personalities, interests, and degrees of success with activities. One of the most notable strengths of people with autism is their strong internal processing. This allows people with autism to dive deep into details and logic and enhances their memory because they're so connected to their thoughts. Temple Grandin, a famous professor and inventor who also happens to be on the autism spectrum, says that visual thinking has enabled her to build entire systems in her imagination. She values her ability to think visually and would never want to lose it. People with autism are often also very compassionate, non-judgmental, and extremely loyal. Because they don't preoccupy themselves with social opinions or expectations as often, they put a lot of their attention into their relationships despite what others may view as reasons to turn away. People with autism are also some of the most intelligent contributors to society. They become experts in their interests and have made some of the most significant achievements for the world in science, technology, agriculture, and more. Who do you know with autism? What are some of their strengths? We challenge you to share their strengths with others and to spread the love. So how does someone go through the process of getting an autism diagnosis? Autism can be diagnosed as early as 2 years old, although signs of autism can be apparent as early as infancy. Most parents whose child later receives a diagnosis of autism previously noticed developmental delays within the first 2 years. Medical professionals most often diagnose autism at age 5, once children have an opportunity to grow out of unfounded delays. A developmental pediatrician or a pediatric neurologist or psychiatrist will use an autism screening tool, a behavior rating scale, or other assessment to determine if a child has the characteristics of autism and how significantly those characteristics impact the child. If autism is not diagnosed by a medical professional, A multidisciplinary team in a public education setting consisting of educators, a social worker, school psychologist, speech therapist, or other educational professionals can assess and diagnose a child with autism starting by age 7. Schools are often reluctant to categorize a child as having autism because having autism does not necessarily mean you need special services, and the goal of a multidisciplinary team diagnosis is for the purpose of getting the child services. If there are concerns that behaviors and other difficulties are impacting a child's ability to fully participate in their education, but an autism diagnosis is unclear, teams will often select the category of developmental delay until either age 7 or a medical diagnosis is submitted to the multidisciplinary team. After age 7, if a child is educationally categorized under developmental delay, the multidisciplinary team must meet to determine a more specific educational category or dismiss services. For more information on how to proceed once someone has been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, see our resources page on our website. For the last part of our time together, we are going to briefly review some strategies that will help support people with autism in your ministry or educational setting. The first strategy focuses on communication. When speaking with people on the autism spectrum, make sure to use clear, simple phrases using non-abstract language. This is a really good practice no matter who you communicate with. Another strategy when communicating is to make things visual whenever possible. This allows people with ASD to connect abstract thinking to a more concrete understanding. It removes the guesswork and supports quicker processing when that may be something that's difficult for them. For example, I was at a friend's house for Thanksgiving one year. We were going around the table talking about which meat each person preferred for the holidays, ham or turkey. One person turned to my friend's brother, who was on the autism spectrum, and said, "What about you? Do you prefer ham over turkey?" Confused, he responded, "What? Why would I want ham on my turkey?" Needless to say, we clarified, and his vote was definitely turkey. Another strategy to consider in focusing on support for people with autism is sensory supports. Sensory is a fancy term for those inputs and outputs we experience through our real senses. People with autism often have a heightened awareness of their sensory experiences. One strategy is to be aware of environments that may be overstimulating and provide breaks if needed. Another strategy is to provide verbal warnings when something unexpectedly loud or bright might happen. An example of sensory conscious support is when you may be going into a crowded auditorium for worship and large group activities. Know ahead of time when to offer breaks so that the person still gets the most inclusive experience, such as at the end of the loud activity but before the important talk. Social situations can be difficult for someone with ASD to navigate. We can be supportive in ministry or education by allowing for alternative means of communicating. For example, having someone with nonverbal autism be the high-fiver when everyone walks through the door. Another strategy to consider for supporting social skills is providing a varied approach to social situations. For example, if someone with autism feels more comfortable in smaller groups, provide an opportunity for them to do all of their sharing in a space with less people. Lastly, here are some strategies for behavior. Behavior can be the most uncomfortable for us to navigate when serving or working in ministry or schools. There's a lot more unpredictability when it comes to behavior. The best way to support someone with ASD is to establish clear expectations and provide positive feedback for appropriate behaviors. For example, you could say, hugging makes me feel uncomfortable because I don't know you that well. Can we high five instead? The key is to approach the uncomfortable situation from the perspective that everyone is still learning. This will allow you to set boundaries without negatively impacting the relationship. And if a problem behavior still occurs, consider offering the person an opportunity to have a redo. This acknowledges good intentions while giving them a chance to practice something that might need a lot of practice. As we wrap up this training, know that we are so grateful for all you do to serve this amazing population in your ministry or school. If you are itching for more in-depth information or strategies, we would love to connect. We provide free initial consultations and have so many cool resources to share. Go check them out.